Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a mysterious face in a 1910 photograph, a woman who was undeniably there, yet completely erased from history, that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the vast, silent archives of history, some artifacts are not merely records of the past, they are vessels. They are prisons, holding a single frozen moment with an unyielding grip. They preserve the delicate interplay of light, shadow, and form with chemical precision. But in doing so, they often bury the most profound truths in plain sight. This is the story of one such artifact, a flawless, heavy glass plate, negative, born of a warm, languid September afternoon in the year 1910. It was intended to be a monument to family, a gleaming testament to order, prosperity, and unwavering unity. Instead, through the slow, inexorable passage of time, it became a tombstone for a memory, the cryptic opening chapter of a mystery that would lie dormant for nearly a century, waiting patiently for a pair of modern eyes that could finally see the ghost hiding in the crowd. The photograph itself is a masterpiece of its era, a carefully constructed tableau vivant of the Halbert family of Mahoning County, Ohio. 23 individuals, spanning 4 generations, are arranged with architectural precision on the wide shaded porch of their family home. The house stands behind them, a proud Victorian structure with intricate gingerbread trim and a gaze that bespoke both mercantile success and an unshakable sense of its own importance. On that afternoon, the late summer sun filtered through the dense leaves of ancient oak trees, dappling the scene in a soft, forgiving light. One can almost hear the faint, distant sounds of Main Street, the gentle clop of a horse-drawn carriage, the rustle of starched linen. It was a moment of profound peace, meticulously staged. In the very center, seated in ornate, hand-carved wooden chairs, as if upon ancestral thrones, are the patriarch and matriarch, Thomas Halbert Sr. and his wife, Elizabeth. Their faces, captured with startling clarity, are etched with the stern piety and quiet certainty of their age. Thomas's hand rests on a cane, though it seems more a symbol of authority than a tool of necessity. A heavy gold watch chain is just visible against his waistcoat. Elizabeth's posture is ramrod straight, her lace collar high and immaculate. They are the twin pillars upon which this entire dynasty rests. At their feet, a collection of grandchildren are scattered like summer wildflowers, their youthful, boundless energy momentarily contained by the gravity of the occasion and the stern gaze of the photographer hidden beneath his black cloth. Behind the seated elders, their adult sons and daughters stand in a formal, protective phalanx. They are a human edifice of generational continuity, their hands resting formally on shoulders, their expressions a mixture of pride and solemnity. Every single individual in this portrait is known. Every name is meticulously recorded in the heavy, leather-bound family Bible, its pages thin and fragile with age. Every life is chronicled in the dense collections of letters and ledgers that the Halberts preserved with a reverence bordering on religious devotion. There is Robert, the eldest son and heir apparent, his confident gaze already looking toward a future he believed was his to command. There is Eloise, his sister, her expression a perfect mask of serene contentment. Their spouses, their children, their cousins from as far as Cleveland, all are accounted for. All occupy their rightful, preordained place in the grand, unblemished tapestry of the Halbert lineage. All, except for one, stand back from the image, and she is merely part of the composition. Another dark dress in a sea of formal attire. But draw closer. Let your eyes drift past the established figures, past the known faces, to the back row. There she is. She is positioned almost protectively between Uncle Robert and Aunt Eloise, a woman who appears to be in her 30s. Her dark hair is styled in the popular Gibson girl fashion, though perhaps with a touch less modern flair, as if her style was frozen in a slightly earlier time. Her dress is of formal black silk, its intricate beadwork catching the light in a way that suggests it was a garment of great pride, perhaps her very finest. But it is her expression that truly arrests the soul. It is not the timid, uncertain look of a distant relative hoping to be included. It is not the deferential, almost invisible glance of a family friend or servant. It is an expression of profound, unshakable stillness. Her gaze is direct. Her lips are set in a faint, enigmatic line that is neither a smile nor a frown. It is an expression of serene confidence, of knowing her place, even if history has forgotten it, most unnervingly. She holds hands with both Robert and Eloise, her fingers interlaced with theirs in a gesture of intimate, casual belonging. She is there. She is undeniably, physically, irrevocably there. Yet, in the vast and obsessively kept archive of the Halbert family, she does not exist. She is a phantom. Her name appears on no census record, no church roll, no property deed, no birth or death certificate connected to this family. She is not mentioned in the hundreds of pages of correspondence, the detailed diaries, the legal wills. She is a face without a name, a presence without a past, a body without a shadow. How can a person be so tangibly captured by light and chemistry, a permanent etching on glass, only to be completely and utterly erased from the written and oral history of the very people she stands amongst? The answer, perhaps, lies not in who she was, but in the world that conspired to unmake her, to understand the deafening silence surrounding her. One must first step into the world of the Halberts, a world that has long since vanished. Ohio in 1910 was the vibrant heartland of a nation hurtling into the modern age. A nation built on the bedrock of industry, unshakable faith, and, above all else, the fragile currency of reputation. The Halberts were the very embodiment of this ideal. Thomas Halbert Sr. was not simply the owner of the Halbert & Sons General Store on Main Street. He was a foundational pillar of his community, a man whose handshake was as binding as any written contract. His world was a quantifiable one, a realm of balanced ledgers, predictable seasons, and unbroken promises. His moral character, like his financial accounting, was considered immaculate. His wife, Elizabeth, was the matriarch not only of her home but of the town's social order. As president of the local women's auxiliary, she presided over a domain of unspoken rules and rigid expectations. She was the arbiter of social grace, moral conduct, and Christian charity, a charity that had its clear and definite limits. According to editions of the Mahoning County Chronicle from that era, the Halbert name was consistently invoked as a paragon of integrity and civic virtue. This obsession with order, with a clean and justifiable record, extended deep into the sanctum of their private lives. The Halberts were not merely a family. They were fervent archivists of their own ascending legacy. They saved everything, believing that a preserved past was the surest guarantee of a prosperous future. Boxes of correspondence, bound neatly in silk ribbon and sorted by year, chronicled every birth, every respectable marriage, every properly mourned death. Their family Bible was not just a religious text, it was a sacred historical document. Its genealogical pages filled with the elegant, spidery ink of generations who were charting not just a family tree, but a manifest destiny. To the Halberts, history was not something that simply happened to them. It was something to be curated, controlled, and presented to the world as a flawless narrative of piety, hard work, and success. Their very identity was built upon this magnificent edifice of perfect record-keeping. This was the moral and social crucible of the Edwardian era, a society governed by a rigid and often brutal architecture of propriety. The lines of class, gender, and conduct were drawn with the unforgiving clarity of a surveyor's map. It was a world where the church steeple cast a long shadow over every home, a constant reminder of a judging God, and where the fear of local gossip was often a more potent force than the fear of eternal damnation. For a family of the Halberts' standing, reputation was the most valuable and most vulnerable currency, and they would protect it with the same quiet ferocity with which a king protects his throne. Within this gilded cage of respectability, there was no sin more socially ruinous, no transgression more utterly catastrophic for a young woman than a pregnancy outside the holy bonds of marriage. It was not seen as a simple personal failing. It was a contagion, a deep stain upon the entire family's honor that could tarnish their name for generations. It was a crack in the pristine foundation of their respectability, a crack that threatened to bring the whole magnificent house down in a heap of shame and whispers. For in a home built of flawless records and unimpeachable honor, the greatest conceivable terror is an entry that cannot be explained, a story that cannot be told, a name that must never, ever be written down. For 93 years, the silence held, the secret was kept, the heavy glass plate lay dormant in a dark, forgotten box, its captured truth locked away in an emulsion of silver and gelatin. The story, and the woman at its center, may have been lost forever to the indifferent currents of time, had it not been for the one force as relentless as the past itself, the insatiable curiosity of a descendant. The year is 2003. In the quiet, book-lined study of his suburban home, Michael Halbert, the great-grandson of Thomas Sr., carefully unpacks the memory of his clan. It had arrived just weeks before in a set of large cardboard boxes, a final bequest from his grandmother's estate. The boxes smelled of cedar, aging paper, and the faint, sweet scent of decay, the perfume of history itself. Michael, a man with a lifelong passion for genealogy and a professional background in digital imaging, saw himself not as the owner of these artifacts, but as their humble custodian. His self-appointed mission was to shepherd these fragile ghosts of the past across the digital divide, to grant them a form of immortality in the binary code of the modern age. In the focused quiet of his study, surrounded by the gentle hum of his computer and the whisper of the scanner, he began his methodical, reverent work. One by one, he would lift the heavy, cool glass plate negatives from their brittle, yellowing protective sleeves. These were not the flimsy celluloid strips of a later age. They were substantial, weighty objects, holding the true physical weight of a captured moment in time. With the precision of an archivist, he would gently clean each plate before placing it with the utmost care onto the brilliantly lit bed of an Epson V850 scanner, a machine designed specifically for this kind of delicate historical resurrection. The process was slow, almost meditative. The scanner's bright light would crawl across the glass, a single deliberate pass converting a century-old image into tens of millions of individual pixels. On his monitor, the past would slowly materialize, blooming into a new, impossibly detailed life. Working in the powerful digital darkroom of Adobe Photoshop, he meticulously restored each image. His movements were precise, respectful, his goal always being restoration, never alteration. He would digitally remove the tiny spots and blemishes that corresponded to physical flaws on the glass, carefully correct for minor scratches etched by 93 years of storage. But he never altered the fundamental content. Every face, every shadow, every blade of grass remained exactly as the town photographer, Hermann Müller, had seen it through his lens in 1910. It was during this painstaking process, while working on the high-resolution file of the grand family reunion, that he first truly saw her. His mouse hovered over the back row as he zoomed in to sharpen a detail on his great-great-uncle's collar. His eyes drifted, and then he froze. A woman's face, serene and confident, filled his screen with a clarity that was almost startling. He leaned closer to the monitor, a flicker of simple curiosity quickly turning into a wave of profound, unsettling unease. He knew every story, every face in his family's extensive lore. He had grown up with these people. Their triumphs and tragedies were his own personal mythology. But this woman, she was a complete stranger. He scanned his memory, frantically searching the vast, detailed library of family history he had so carefully constructed in his mind, and he came back with nothing. A complete void. There was no story, no anecdote, no passing mention, not even a whisper of a name. Yet, she stared back at him from across the century, her calm, steady gaze, a silent question that seemed to pierce through time itself. In that chilling moment, as the hum of his computer filled the silence of the room, Michael Halbert realized he had inherited more than just a box of old photographs and forgotten letters. He had inherited a ghost, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not rest until he learned her name. That certainty became the new gravitational center of Michael Halbert's world. The ghost on the glass plate was no longer a mere genealogical curiosity. She was an obligation, a silent summons from a forgotten past that he felt constitutionally, almost spiritually, unable to ignore. His first steps were guided by a hopeful, almost naive logic. If she was a person, then surely someone must have known her. The investigation began not in the sterile silence of an archive, but with the warm, familiar tremble of a telephone call. His fingers hesitated over the keypad, a strange sense of trepidation washing over him, the feeling of an explorer about to step into an unmapped cave. He was not just asking a question, he was probing a wound he didn't yet understand. He chose to call his great-aunt Sarah first. At 89 years old, Sarah was the family's officially designated historian, a woman whose mind was a sprawling living library of Halbert lore, anecdotes, and secrets. The phone rang for a long time, each electronic ring echoing the preternatural quiet of a sun-drenched Florida condominium. When she finally answered, her voice was thin but needle-sharp, filled with the genuine pleasure of an unexpected call from her grandnephew. Michael spoke carefully, respectfully, painting a picture with his words as he had done so many times for himself. He described the woman in the back row, her serene and unsettling expression, her dark hair, the quietly defiant way she held hands with Robert and Eloise, two people Sarah had known personally in the twilight of their lives. He emailed her the high-resolution image as they spoke, a digital ghost sent across 1,000 miles in an instant. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled only by the faint hum of a computer and the vast, humming distance between them. He could hear the soft, distinct click of her mouse as she opened the file. "Michael," she finally said, her voice stripped of its earlier warmth. It was now laced with a strange, defensive confusion that set his nerves on edge. "I'm looking right at her. I have never seen this woman in my life." It was not a statement of a failing, elderly memory. It was a declaration of absolute fact, delivered with the unwavering finality of a judge's gavel. That same chilling scene replayed itself over the following weeks, becoming a painful, soul-wearying ritual. He systematically contacted a dozen living relatives spanning 3 generations, from a second cousin in Cleveland who prided himself on his encyclopedic knowledge of the family's business history, to an elderly uncle in Pittsburgh who had been the executor of multiple complex family estates. Each conversation began with the same hopeful curiosity and ended with the same firm, unequivocal denial. They all saw the same image, the same undeniable presence. Yet their collective memory offered nothing but a unified, resounding, and deeply unsettling void. This was not simple forgetfulness. This was a historical impossibility for a clan as self-obsessed and meticulous as the Halberts. The silence he encountered was not empty. It was solid. It was a wall, built of unspoken agreements and secrets kept for a century. He began to feel, with a growing dread, that he was not investigating a forgotten relative, but a carefully, almost perfectly, orchestrated erasure. The conflict was no longer between a photograph and an absence of records. It was between the immutable truth captured on a sliver of glass and the powerful, deliberate amnesia of his own bloodline. The central question of his quest shifted from a simple "who is she?" to a far more chilling inquiry. Why was she so completely and utterly disowned by history itself? With the path of oral tradition having turned into a monolithic wall of denial, Michael pivoted his strategy. If the family's memory was a compromised, unreliable witness, he would turn to the cold, impartial, and unforgiving testimony of the written record. His obsession took on the methodical, painstaking rhythm of a professional historian, a man possessed. The hunt moved from the warmth of family connections to the musty, silent chill of archives and courthouse basements. For months that stretched into years, he descended into these quiet tombs of the past, spending countless hours hunched over microfilm readers, the ghostly green and white text scrolling before his burning, red-rimmed eyes. In these subterranean rooms, the air itself smelled of aging paper, brittle leather, and the faint, metallic scent of decay, the very aroma of forgotten stories. He began his search in the voluminous archives of Mahoning County, methodically unspooling the 1910 federal census records. He examined all 847 individual entries for the township, cross-referencing every woman between the ages of 20 and 40 against the sprawling branches of his family tree. He found nothing. He spent weeks cloistered in the basement archives of the Youngstown Vindicator, his white-gloved fingers carefully turning the massive, fragile pages of every social column, every obituary, every wedding announcement published between 1905 and 1915. He was searching for any mention of a friend, a distant cousin, a business associate, anyone who might have had a tangible connection to the Halbert family. The newspaper's pages were filled with the Halberts' respectable, well-documented activities, but the woman's face, her story, was nowhere to be found. He turned to the records of the local Methodist Church, the very institution that had forged his family's rigid moral universe. He scrutinized birth records, baptismal certificates, and marriage licenses, his finger tracing the elegant, looping script of 100 different clerks from 100 years ago. He analyzed student rosters from Jefferson Elementary School and property transfers at the county courthouse. Every document he touched, every record he scanned, only served to deepen the void, to make the silence around her louder. She was not just absent, she was surgically absent, excised from the official narrative with a precision that was both masterful and terrifying. Frustrated by the limitations of the past, he brought the fight into the 21st century. In the sterile quiet of his home office, a world of humming hard drives and glowing screens, he deployed the most advanced tools available to him. In 2015, he uploaded the pristine 6400 DPI scan of the woman's face to Amazon's recognition system, a powerful facial recognition engine driven by artificial intelligence. He ran the software against a custom-built database of over 3,000 historical photographs from the Mahoning County Historical Society and other regional archives. He watched, mesmerized, as the algorithm mapped the precise geometry of her face, the distance between her eyes, the curve of her jawline, the unique cartography of her features, and compared it against a sea of forgotten faces. The process took hours. The result appeared on his screen in cold, sterile, and unforgiving text, no matches found. The pressure on him mounted. He had exhausted oral history. He had exhausted the paper trail. Now, even the dispassionate, all-seeing eye of a machine could not find her. Her erasure felt absolute, almost supernatural, defeated. He would often just stare at the image on his monitor for hours, letting his eyes roam over the pixels as if they might, through sheer force of will, yield their secret. And it was in one of these moments of quiet contemplation that he noticed it again, but this time with the sharpened focus of a seasoned investigator. Her dress. He had previously noted its slightly outdated style, but now he saw it for what it was, a clue. It was a concrete piece of data in a case built entirely on absences. He dove into a new kind of archive, the vast digital collections of fashion plates and department store catalogs from the turn of the century. He meticulously compared her silhouette, the distinct cut of her sleeves, the restrictive high collar, and the specific floral pattern of the beadwork on her bodice. His research confirmed his suspicion with startling clarity. The dress was not from 1910. Its style belonged to the mid-1890s, in an era of rapidly and rigidly changing fashions. Wearing a dress that was over a decade old to a formal family gathering was a significant, telling statement. It was a whisper from the past, a tangible clue that this woman was somehow different, that her connection to the Halberts was not as straightforward as it appeared. It was the first tiny crack of light in a wall of darkness that had remained impenetrable for so very long. Years continued to pass. Michael's investigation slowed to a crawl, the trail growing colder with each passing season. The mystery had become a quiet, permanent fixture in his life, a puzzle he feared he might carry to his own grave, forever unsolved. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not with a thunderclap of discovery of his own making, but with the quiet, unassuming rustle of old paper in a place he had never thought to look. Discovered by a man he had never met. The year was 2017, a full 14 years after Michael's initial discovery. In the quiet, climate-controlled archives of the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, a volunteer researcher named David Chen was engaged in the slow, methodical, and often thankless task of cataloging a recently acquired collection of unsorted documents. The papers had been donated by a Methodist church in Youngstown and had sat in unprocessed archival boxes for years. Chen was a retired history teacher with a quiet, scholarly passion for uncovering the small, human stories that are so often lost in the grand, sweeping narratives of the past. He was working his way through a box of church correspondence from the early 1900s when he found it. It was a single letter, folded neatly into quarters, its paper yellowed and as brittle as a dried leaf. The handwriting was a controlled, elegant cursive, but it was the names written in that script that made Chen pause. The letter was dated March 15th, 1909. It was addressed to Mr. Thomas Halbert, Sr., and it was signed by Reverend John Morrison, a pastor whose name Chen recognized from the church's official history. A jolt of a historian's intuition, that electric feeling of connection across time, shot through him. He carefully unfolded the document, his heart beating a little faster. The letter's tone was formal, as was the custom. Yet it was underlined with a palpable current of deep compassion and urgent concern. Reverend Morrison began with pleasantries before turning to the somber purpose of his letter, what he referred to as the matter of Marianne and her unfortunate circumstance. The name hung in the air of the silent archive, a name that had been voiceless for more than a century. Marianne. For the first time, the ghost had a name. The Reverend wrote that he understood Thomas's difficult decision regarding the girl, but he hoped, with all sincerity, that Christian charity might eventually prevail. He went on to describe Marianne as having been a faithful servant to your household, and gently, diplomatically suggested that her present condition was not entirely of her own making. The letter concluded with the Reverend's earnest hope that Thomas might reconsider his harsh position once passions have cooled and Christian forgiveness can guide your heart. David Chen sat back heavily in his chair, the full, shocking weight of the carefully chosen words settling upon him. The disparate pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know he was solving snapped together with a horrifying, instantaneous clarity. A servant girl. An unfortunate circumstance in 1909. A gentle clerical euphemism for an out-of-wedlock pregnancy almost too plain to be misunderstood. A harsh, swift decision by the patriarch. Thomas Halbert. Dismissal. Disgrace. Exile. This single fragile piece of paper was not just a historical document. It was the Rosetta Stone of the entire mystery. It was the motive for the crime of historical erasure. It explained everything. And yet, at the same time, it explained nothing at all. Because if Thomas Halbert had cast Marianne out in disgrace in the spring of 1909 to save his family from scandal, then why, in God's name, was she standing confidently among them just 18 months later, her hands clasped warmly with theirs, immortalized in their most important and public family portrait? The mystery of who she was had finally been solved, only to be replaced by a new, infinitely darker, and more profound enigma. What in the world happened next? That final, haunting question, what happened next, shifted the entire investigation from the realm of historical inquiry into something far more urgent and profound. With a name, a date, and now a motive, Michael Halbert was no longer searching for a ghost. He was pursuing the faint, cold trail of a victim. The letter from Reverend Morrison was a powerful, earth-shattering revelation, but in the face of a century of silence, it was still just a single voice, a plea written on fragile, aging paper. To truly understand the magnitude of what had occurred, to build a case against the judgment of history itself, the story needed to be anchored in the unyielding bedrock of irrefutable scientific fact. The focus now turned away from dusty archives and back to the two silent, central witnesses, the letter itself, and the haunting glass plate negative that had launched this entire obsessive quest. Armed with this explosive new context, Michael knew he had to eliminate every last shred of doubt. Any lingering suggestion that the photograph was a fluke, a trick of the light, or a sophisticated, Later manipulation had to be scientifically and systematically dismantled through his academic connections. He was put in touch with Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a distinguished professor of American history at Case Western Reserve University, who had previously consulted on projects involving federal law enforcement agencies. Intrigued by the case's unique and challenging nature, Dr. Kellerman facilitated a process that is almost unheard of for a private family mystery. She arranged for the original 1910 glass plate negative to be examined by forensic imaging specialists at the FBI's renowned laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The journey of that small, heavy piece of glass from a quiet suburban home to one of the most advanced forensic facilities in the world was a pilgrimage from one century into the heart of another. In the sterile, climate-controlled clean rooms of the FBI lab, the artifact was subjected to a battery of tests that would have been pure science fiction to its creator, Hermann Mueller, under powerful electron microscopes. Technicians analyzed the microscopic grain structure of the silver halide emulsion, looking for inconsistencies using spectrographic analysis. They determined the precise chemical composition of the glass and the gelatin binder, confirming that they were perfectly consistent with materials produced by the Eastman Kodak Company in the years leading up to 1910. The subtle patterns of chemical degradation, the microscopic blooms of decay, were all consistent with a genuine artifact that had aged naturally and undisturbed for nearly a century. The analysis was definitive and unanimous. The negative was authentic, but the most crucial tests were yet to come. The specialists focused on the central, nagging question: could the image have been altered? Was Marianne a later addition? A ghostly figure from another negative seamlessly composited into the family portrait. They examined the image for any signs of double exposure, for telltale inconsistencies in the emulsion's density, or for the microscopic fingerprints of a doctored plate. They found none. The final, damning piece of evidence came from an advanced analysis of the photograph's internal geometry, the angles and diffusion of the light and shadows. The way the late afternoon sun fell across the wooden porch, the soft, elongated shadows cast by Thomas Sr.'s ornate chair, the precise glint of light of a single bead on Marianne's dress, all were perfectly, mathematically consistent. The forensic reports confirmed, beyond any possible doubt, that all 23 people in the photograph had been present on that porch at the same time, under the same single light source. When the camera's shutter clicked open and shut, the photograph was not a forgery. It was not a mistake. It was the truth. In parallel, the letter from Reverend Morrison was subjected to its own equally rigorous examination. It was sent to Dr. Margaret Stevenson, a leading paleography expert at the Smithsonian Institution. There, the document was treated with the same reverence as a founding state document. The composition of the paper, a common linen rag bond, was verified as appropriate for the period. The ink was identified as a standard iron gall ink, its patterns of oxidation consistent with a document over 100 years old. But the most critical analysis was of the handwriting itself. Dr. Stevenson meticulously compared the letter to dozens of other known samples of Reverend Morrison's hand from the same period sermon notes, church ledgers, and official correspondence. The distinct pressure of the pen nib on the paper, the characteristic slant of the letters, the unique way he formed his capital M, every idiosyncratic feature matched perfectly. The conclusion was as unshakable as the FBI's. The letter was undeniably authentic. Reverend John Morrison had, in fact, written to Thomas Halbert Sr. on March 15, 1909, to plead the case of a disgraced servant girl named Marianne. With these two mighty pillars of evidence now standing firm, one of forensic science, the other of historical scholarship, The vague outlines of the tragedy sharpened into a horrifyingly clear picture. There was no longer any room for doubt or charitable interpretation. There was only the chilling, methodical reconstruction of a crime. Not a crime of passion, but a crime of calculation. A quiet, systematic, and soul-crushing act of social execution. This was not a confession shouted from a witness stand under oath. It was a mute confession, pieced together from the evidence the perpetrators left behind. A story told by the cold, conspiratorial silence of the Halbert family itself. One must imagine the scene in the dead of winter. 1909. A tense conversation, not in the family parlor where warmth and light resided, but in the cold, masculine confines of Thomas Sr.'s private study. A room of dark, heavy wood, leather-bound books, and the smell of old paper and quiet, powerful money. Here, the unfortunate circumstance of Marianne would not have been treated as a human tragedy, but as a dire and unforeseen threat to the family's meticulously balanced ledger of reputation. The questions asked would not have been of compassion, but of containment. Who knew? How could this be controlled? The identity of the father, almost certainly one of the Halbert sons who stood so proudly in the reunion photograph, was a secondary problem. A messy detail that could be managed internally. The primary problem, the source of the contagion, was Marianne herself. She and her unborn child were a liability that had to be liquidated from the family's portfolio of honor. And so, the decision was made, not in a fit of explosive rage, but with the same cold pragmatism Thomas Halbert applied to a failing business venture. She would be dismissed, her final wages paid, her few belongings packed. She would be sent away, vanishing from the respectable world of Mahoning County forever. But the true darkness, the very heart of the crime, was not in her dismissal alone. It was in the systematic, cold-blooded erasure of her very existence that followed. This was a dark unveiling. We can envision the quiet, terrible work that took place in the days after her departure. Any letters she may have written, any small gifts she may have given to the children, would have been methodically gathered from the house and burned to ash in the hearth. Her name would have been struck from any household employment records. And then came the most powerful and insidious act of all, the unspoken ironclad command, issued through the sheer force of the patriarch's will, that Marianne was to be forgotten. Her name was never to be spoken again within the walls of that house. She was to become an unperson, the family's collective silence, the perfect, unified amnesia that Michael Halbert would encounter a century later. Was not an accident of time. It was a conspiracy of memory, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of their patriarch's silent decree. This is what makes her presence in the 1910 photograph so utterly confounding, so profoundly, psychologically unsettling. The family had gone to extraordinary lengths to excise her from their world, to treat her as if she had never drawn breath. And yet, there she stands, at the very heart of their most sacred public ritual of unity. Her presence a stunning, defiant contradiction to the brutal finality of their judgment. What power, what force, could have possibly reversed such an absolute decree? What could have compelled a man like Thomas Halbert Sr. to allow the very ghost he had personally exorcised to return and haunt his family's perfect portrait? Was it a momentary lapse of his iron will, a brief, flickering candle of guilt in the vast darkness of his pragmatism? Or was it a concession to someone else in the family, a beloved son, perhaps consumed by a secret love or a guilty conscience, who made her presence a non-negotiable condition of his own? The photograph, once a simple record of a happy day, was now transformed into the scene of a silent, psychological war. It was proof not of a reconciliation, but of a profound and deeply unresolved conflict back in the present day. As this horrifyingly clear picture formed in Michael Halbert's mind, the question of consequences began to loom large. The first and most bitter pill to swallow was the utter absence of any conventional justice. There would be no trial, no legal reckoning. The perpetrators of this quiet cruelty were long dead, their bones having returned to dust in the very churchyard where they once projected an image of flawless piety. The crime was one of moral and social violence, its statutes of limitation having expired almost as soon as it was committed. Justice, in any legal sense, was a ghost as unreachable as Marianne herself. The true repercussions, therefore, were not legal, but historical and deeply personal. The entire carefully constructed legacy of the Halbert family had been built on a foundation of lies. And Michael had just unearthed the foundational crack that compromised the whole structure. The family history he had so lovingly set out to preserve was now irrevocably tainted. Their public story of pioneering spirit, commercial success, and Christian virtue was now forever intertwined with a secret history of exploitation, cruelty, and a ruthless, systematic suppression of the truth. The photograph, once a cherished symbol of family unity, now felt like a monument to their hypocrisy, its serene surface belying the turbulent darkness that lay beneath. This was the verdict of time, a judgment rendered not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, horrified conscience of a descendant. For Michael, the waste of this discovery was immense. He was no longer just a curious genealogist or a family historian. He had, by an accident of fate, become the sole custodian of Marianne's stolen story. He was the keeper of a truth that his own ancestors had fought with all their might to bury forever. The silence they had so masterfully constructed for a century had finally been broken, and the sound was now deafening in his ears. The burden was now his to carry, to tell her story, to restore her name to the historical record from which it had been so brutally excised, was the only form of justice Marianne would ever receive. He had started his journey hoping to color in the branches of his family tree, only to discover that the tree itself had grown from poisoned soil. The discovery of such a foundational lie does not merely add a new, dark chapter to a family's history. It demolishes the entire book, forcing the survivors to rebuild a new narrative from the scorched and scattered pages. For Michael Halbert and the living descendants, the centuries of respectable Halbert history could no longer be read in the same way. The entire structure of their identity, built upon a carefully curated myth of piety and unwavering integrity, had collapsed into dust. The proud, leather-bound family Bible, once a sacred record of their lineage, now felt like a work of deliberate, calculated fiction, more notable for the single, crucial name it omitted than for all the names it contained. The stoic portraits of the ancestors that hung in hallways, once gazed upon with aspirational pride, were now viewed through a new, painful lens of suspicion and sorrow. Thomas Halbert Sr., the stern patriarch, was no longer a symbol of foundational strength, but a monument to a profound and chilling moral compromise. This was the great collapse. It was not the fall of a physical house, but the shattering of an essential myth. And in its wake came the slow, painful, and necessary process of redefinition. The history of the Halbert family had to be entirely rewritten, no longer as a simple linear tale of American success, but as a complex and tragic drama centered around a deliberate, gaping void. Their commercial prosperity was no longer just a testament to hard work, but a grim reminder of who was sacrificed for the sake of that success. Every recorded achievement was now shadowed by a single, unforgivable act of cruelty. The adult sons who stood so proudly in the 1910 photograph were redefined from proud heirs into a lineup of silent suspects, each one a potential collaborator in a lifelong conspiracy of silence and denial. And in the most profound and bitter irony of all, Marianne, the woman they had tried so desperately to make a non-entity, was herself redefined. Through their very act of erasing her, they had inadvertently guaranteed her immortality. She was no longer a footnote, she was the headline. From the nameless ghost in the background, she was resurrected as the central, pivotal figure in their entire lineage. Her story, once a liability to be buried at all costs, had become the single, defining lens through which their entire history would now be viewed and judged. In their ruthless campaign to make her invisible, the Halberts had, a century later, ensured she would be the only one who was truly, finally seen. The servant girl they had cast out had returned, not as a ghost, but as the unwilling matriarch of their true and tarnished legacy. That legacy, however, is a haunted one, for the redefinition of the past did nothing to answer the agonizing questions that now shadow the future. The truth of Marianne's exile had been uncovered, but the truth of her life remained stubbornly, infuriatingly out of reach. Her ultimate fate is perhaps the most haunting secret of all. The historical record, which had been so unnaturally silent about her connection to the Halberts, proved to be just as silent about her existence after the photograph was taken. Meticulous searches of census records, marriage certificates, and death certificates in Ohio and surrounding states for the years following 1910 have yielded absolutely nothing. It is as if, after standing for that one defiant moment on the Halbert porch, she walked off it and simply vanished from the face of the earth. Did she die in childbirth? Her name registered under a pseudonym, or perhaps not at all? Did she move far away to a place where no one knew her story and begin a new life under a new name? And what became of her child, the infant who would have carried the Halbert name and bloodline in secret? Did that child survive? Did they grow up wondering about the father they never knew? These are not questions that can be answered. Official records state nothing. Historians can only speculate. Marianne appears for that one brilliant, defiant moment in the photograph, and then is swallowed once more by the same profound silence from which she emerged. This makes her presence in the photo even more poignant, more mysterious. It was not the beginning of her return, but the very end of her story. It was her final, silent farewell. And with her disappearance, other secrets were buried forever. Chief among them is the identity of the father. One's eyes are inevitably drawn to the men in the back row of the photograph, particularly to Robert Halbert, the eldest son, whose hand she holds with such telling familiarity. Was it him, the heir to the Halbert legacy, who fathered a child in secret, or was it one of his brothers? Their faces perfect masks of formal composure without any known descendants of Marianne to conduct modern DNA analysis. The truth is lost to time, a secret that all the Halbert sons took with them to their graves. And perhaps that is its own form of justice. The specific guilt can never be assigned to one, and so its shadow falls over them all, a collective stain on their generation. This leaves us with the final, unanswerable question, the core of the haunting legacy she left behind. What does her presence in that photograph truly signify for over a century? Two competing theories have been debated by those who know the story. The first is the theory of reconciliation. It posits that perhaps Thomas Halbert Sr., pricked by his conscience and moved by the compassionate plea of Reverend Morrison, experienced a genuine change of heart, that perhaps, in a final act of Christian charity, he allowed Marianne to be included in the family's most important gathering as a single. final gesture of acknowledgement and forgiveness before she disappeared from their lives forever. In this reading, her calm expression is one of serene acceptance, a woman at peace with her fate. But there is a second, more compelling, and far more dramatic theory, the theory of defiance. This theory suggests that the decision was not Thomas Halbert's at all. It proposes that one of the sons, the father of her child, consumed by a rare moment of love, guilt, or duty, refused to allow her to be utterly disowned. Perhaps he made her presence a non-negotiable condition of his own, threatening to reveal the entire scandal if she were denied her place in the photograph. In this reading, the scene is not one of peace, but of immense, unspoken tension. Thomas Halbert is forced to choose between two potential scandals, and he chooses the lesser of two evils, allowing her presence for a single moment to maintain the silence forever. In this version of the story, Marianne's calm expression is not one of acceptance, but of quiet, triumphant victory. She is not a guest being granted a kindness. She is a woman who has claimed her rightful, if temporary, place. A silent testament to a truth that her powerful employers could not entirely bury. We will never know which version is true. And so, she remains forever caught between forgiveness and defiance, a serene enigma. Ultimately, the case of the mysterious woman in the 1910 photograph transcends the story of a single family. It forces us to confront profound questions about the very nature of memory, documentation, and historical truth. In an age where we assume that important people and events leave clear, indelible traces in the historical record, Marianne's story is a chilling reminder that entire lives can be erased with a remarkable and terrifying thoroughness. The Halberts, with their meticulous ledgers and family Bibles, created a written history that was, in its most important aspect, a complete and deliberate lie. Their archives were not a record of the truth. They were a monument to the version of the truth they wished to be true. And what stood against this mountain of curated falsehood? A single fragile piece of glass, a mechanical, chemical process that, unlike the humans who commissioned it, had no capacity for deceit. The photograph stands as the only honest proof that she was ever considered part of the Halbert family. Yet that single, unblinking piece of evidence contradicts everything else we know about her relationship with them. It raises more questions than it answers. And perhaps that is its most important function. It challenges our assumptions about truth, memory, and the reliability of the past itself. The 1910 reunion photograph was meant to preserve a moment of family unity and celebration for posterity. Instead, it has become a timeless puzzle, a warning about who gets to write history and who is silenced. After more than 2 decades of investigation, using everything from traditional archival research to cutting-edge forensic technology, Marianne remains an enigma. We know that she existed. We know that she served in the Halbert household. We know that she experienced a disgrace that led to her dismissal. And we know that despite everything, she was present at the most important family gathering, standing with a confidence and dignity that defied the very people who had tried to erase her. But we do not know how her story ended. We do not know what became of her after that September day in 1910, or why every trace of her existence was so thoroughly expunged from memory. She is not in any record. Yet she stands there, frozen forever in the only image that survived, her hands clasped with theirs, her expression serene and confident, as if she belonged, as if she had always belonged, as if no amount of scandal or shame or time could change the fundamental truth of her connection to this family. Perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of this entire mystery. In 1910, the camera truly could not lie, and its honest, unblinking eye is telling us something profound, that sometimes the people we choose to forget are the very ones who refuse to be forgotten. It leaves us with a final, lingering question. Was Marianne forgotten, or was she erased? And in a world where digital manipulation makes all evidence suspect, what does it mean that the most honest record of her life comes from a moment when deception of this kind was nearly impossible? Perhaps the real question isn't just about her, but about ourselves. How many other Mariannes are out there, waiting silently in the background of our own perfect family portraits? Their stories waiting for the one person willing to look closely enough to finally see them.